remember when my friends and I first caught the bus to the mall. Back in the 90s, the mall was the place to be, right? Like you went to eat there, you went to meet people there, you went to buy clothes. But if you were really, really cool, you would spend your Saturday in the mall. It was pointless, still is. But on this particular time, we thought we were cool because we caught the bus by ourselves and we're there in the mall and we're walking past this store, my two friends and I hear this yell. And we turn and we look at the yell, and it's this little boy screaming, "Daddy, that dude, daddy, that dude." We're like, what is wrong with this kid? And so we just kept walking. But then the voice picked up. He's yelling at the top of his voice, "Daddy, that dude." And he starts running towards us. But the little dude forgot that, or he didn't realize that there was a glass door. And he's like, "Daddy, that dude," and runs right into the door. And I laughed. I mean, I'm a teenager. It was funny to me. So he picks himself up and he gets through the door. He runs right over to us. And you know who he grabs? He grabs me. He's like, "Daddy." And I look down to the little squirt. I'm like, whose kid is this? And his mom comes over to me and she's like, "I'm so sorry, he does that sometimes. He thought you were his dad." I'm like, he, no way. Not yet anyway. Hadn't met my bride, hadn't met my Sheila yet. The same way that kid was convinced that I was his dad, the same way that he had mistaken me for being someone who I wasn't, is the same way that some people have convinced themselves that it's okay to worship their heroes. You guys know what hero worship is, don't you? Hero worship is when you begin to idolize someone. This is far beyond like, "Oh, I admire them. Like they're good at basketball, or they're good at writing, or they're a good manager. They're a good CEO. They're a good swimmer." It goes beyond that to flat out idolizing the person to where you know all of their personal information, you know all their stats, all their statistics, and you start to model yourself after them, hoping that some way, somehow, either you can get closer to them or they'll recognize you. Hero worship is a horrible thing, because we weren't created to worship anything else other than God. And a lot of people have mistaken worship. It moves beyond a coincidental, accidental, mistaken identity to a flat out mistaken worship. I remember in 2009 when Michael Jackson passed away. I remember watching the news reports because Sheila and I, we were like kind of like in shock. We grew up in the 80s and we were big Michael Jackson fans. And people were like literally like losing their minds trying to figure out what it's going to be like to live in a world without Michael Jackson. How many of you have ever seen any of his old concerts when people were like losing themselves in the concert? Like people are crying and fainting and losing themselves, right? That's a form of hero worship. They are awestruck with that person. And you're sitting here like, where is this dude going? Like, no one's ever going to worship me. I don't worship people. But hold on. Because people do worship people. And you don't have to be famous. You don't have to be Michael Jackson. You don't have to be someone super special to be worshiped. People worship people. And when that happens, it's mistaken worship. When that happens, we rob God of his glory. Mistaken worship is an issue that all of us have to contend with. It's a thin line between being impressed with someone and then flat out actually worshiping them. Thankfully, the Lord didn't leave us alone to figure this out. Thankfully, God left us some instructions regarding how to worship, who to worship, and all of that. And he gave us an example of two men who were raised up on a pedestal as gods that never should have been lifted up to that point, and how they responded to all of that. So if you have your Bibles, open up to the book of Acts chapter 14. If you need a copy of God's word, you can go to our website, bridgefellowshipchurch.com, and you go down to the button that says message notes, and there you'll find a Google form with the scripture on it, and also fill in the blanks for the message notes. But these apostles, they had to contend with this. And I'm so grateful that we're going to learn from them today how to contend with hero worship, how to contend with mistaken identity. Here's where we're going, guys. This is my gigantic, big idea. God alone deserves to be worshiped. And I want to share with you 4 things that you can do, 4 things that we should be doing to make sure that our worship remains pointed vertically where it belongs. Starting with this one. Check your motivation. Check your motivation. Make sure that God's glory is driving you. Make sure that God's glory is driving you. Make sure that you're being motivated by the right thing, by the right person. You see, our desire to have the thing that we want, it drives us. And we will stop at nothing until we have that thing, until we get that experience. In the case of Paul and Barnabas, we're going to see here in a little bit, their desire to glorify God by making more disciples, it drove them to the farthest reaches of the globe just so that another person could hear the gospel and respond to it and get saved. And these men were willing to endure whatever hardship they had to endure if it meant that one more person had an opportunity to hear the gospel for the first time and ultimately to respond to it. Verse 7 says this. It says, there they continue preaching the gospel. There, Barnabas and Paul continue preaching the gospel. And so when we start here, it's like you're being thrown right into the middle of a story. On last week, we learned that Barnabas and Paul had been doing what? They had been doing missionary work in the city of Iconium, and they were successful at it. Lots of people got saved, and so they stayed behind there, and they started to mature people and to disciple people, and things are going great. That was until some people who were religious and irreligious got upset at them, and they basically tried to kill them. And the word gets out, and they flee, Barnabas and Paul, they flee Iconium for Derbe and Lystra. And when we catch up with them, that is exactly where they are at. These guys, they want everyone to experience the joy and the comfort that comes from knowing Jesus Christ as their personal Savior. They want people to get connected back to God, thus enabling them to honor God with their very, very best. These guys have what I call the I can't help it's. That's when you can't help yourself from doing something. That's when you are driven by a force that you can't even describe. That's when you have to fulfill that thing it is that you think you need to do. It draws you in and it takes you where it wants to go. In and of itself, the I can't help it, they aren't a bad thing per se, but it depends on what the object of your worship is. It depends what your motivation is. For example, if you want more of Jesus, that's a good pursuit. That's a righteous pursuit. By all means, give yourself over to his leadership. Pursue him. Like, cast off those things that are holding you back, those sin issues, those heart issues that are holding you back, so you can pursue him more readily. If you need to add some things, some disciplines to your life. Add some disciplines to your life so that you can pursue Jesus Christ. However, if something or someone other than Jesus has become the object of your worship, then the I can't help it will only make the situation worse. Because we were designed to worship God, because we can't help but worship God, if we don't have our focus on the right thing, if our motivation is on the right, we're not being motivated by the right thing, we will pursue the wrong thing. We were designed to worship. We have to worship. We were designed to worship God. And if we're not worshiping God, then by default, that means we worship Satan. We're drawn to this idea of worshiping God very much like a moth is drawn to a flame. You guys have heard that saying before, right? Like a moth to a flame, right? Did you know that moths are predisposed to pursue light through something that's called phototaxis? Like, they can't help but be drawn to light. Some organisms are phototaxis positive, that's a moth, and some are phototaxis negative, and that would be like the bugs I hate, cockroaches. When the lights come on, they flee, but moths go towards the light. Moths can't help but do it. If a moth was in here or a gnat or some other type of insect, it would go right up into that spotlight and get burned up, but it wouldn't care as long as it was by the light. We're just like that. We were predisposed to worship. Here's what worship is. Worship is genuine worship is a direct expression of our ultimate purpose for living, which is to glorify God and fully enjoy him forever. That's why God designed us. That's why God created us. Paul says it this way in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 11 through 12. He says, we were predestined and appointed by God to live for the praise of his glory. So biblical worship involves praising God and giving him glory with our lips and also our lives. Biblical worship isn't just something that you say, isn't just something that you do, but it's something that's a part of your entire being. From your thoughts to your lips to the way that you carry yourself. Biblical worship, it impacts everything about you. Genuine Christ-centered worship is good, but if you're not careful, if you misplace your motivation and you allow your heart to take you where it wants to go, if you allow that to happen and engage in things that rob God of his glory, you're going to find yourself in trouble. Don't grieve God by doing something that's opposed to his worship. God gave you the desire to worship, so there's nothing wrong with doing it. However, our hearts are prone to wander, aren't they? Our hearts are prone to wander. As much as we want to honor God with our entire day, our entire week, our entire whatever, we know that there's moments throughout the day, moments throughout that week where we are not doing very good jobs of honoring God because our hearts and our thoughts have wandered away from him. Regrettably, a number of people have failed to see Jesus through the gospel because they got caught up in their needs. That's where we're going to go next. Everyone has needs. Just don't let them precede Jesus. Don't put your needs in front of Jesus. Look at verse number 8 with me. It says, in Lystra, we're going to meet another character here. In Lystra, a man was sitting who was without strength in his feet, had never walked, and had been lame from birth. He listened as Paul spoke. That's a key phrase there. Don't forget that first part of verse number 9. He listened as Paul spoke. After looking directly at him and seeing that he had faith to be healed, Paul said in a loud voice, "Stand up on your feet." And he jumped up and he began to walk around. So Paul's preaching the gospel, and this group of people, this crowd begins to form around him. And out of this mixed crowd, there's one person who's singled out. There's one individual who's singled out, and that's this guy who's been lame, who's been handicapped from birth. It says that he listened to Paul as he spoke. He sat up and he looked in. He listened in to Paul as he was speaking. Paul was saying something that he had never heard before. And so he's giving Paul his undivided attention. He wanted to understand the message. He wanted to hear more about this Jesus. Instead of focusing on what he thought he needed, which would have been food and clothing and money, because back in those days, if a person was handicapped, typically they had to like figure out life there by themselves. There was no welfare system, and if your loved ones didn't take care of you, you had to beg for food. But he's not focused on any of those things. He's not stressed out about where he's going to stay or any of that. He turns his attention to a message of hope, a message of salvation. And at that moment, when he does that, when it says in verse number 9, that first part, he listens in. At that moment when he does that, he was more concerned with what could be than what he didn't have. I love that. At that moment, he was more concerned with what could be, the prospect of being saved, the prospect of being with Jesus, than what he didn't have. Jesus is working on this man's heart. Don't raise your hands when I ask you this question. How many of us are guilty of doing the exact opposite? How many of us tend to place our needs from time to time in front of Jesus? I think all of us are guilty of failing to see Jesus because we were distracted by what we didn't have. Full disclosure here. Like this morning, things weren't going the way I wanted them to go for church service, and I got distracted by that. Instead of focusing on what we're doing right now, which is worshiping God and learning and praising him. When we put things that we think that we need in front of Jesus, it hinders us. It hinders us from being able to give God full and complete, genuine worship from our hearts. When we do that, we persuade ourselves that our lives are going to be better once we have what we need. When we do that, we convince ourselves that life is going to be better if we had the thing that we think that we needed. We start to spiral around in this thing called a if-then vortex. If only I can make more money, then life would be so much better. Life would be so much easier. If only I had better health, I would smile more. I would be more hospitable. If only he or she would tell me they love me more, then I would respect them more. If only my kids would listen to me, oh boy, I would sacrifice more time for them. We get caught up in this vortex, this never-ending cycle of if then. Loved ones, tomorrow isn't promised. And if you are not satisfied in Jesus Christ right now, hear me when I say this. If you are not satisfied in Jesus Christ right now, if Jesus isn't enough, if Jesus isn't your all in all, if you are not content in Jesus Christ like right now, then no matter what he gives you or whatever you give yourself, it will never be enough. You're always going to be wanting more. You're always going to be craving, desiring more and more and more. And when you get it, you still won't be satisfied. Jesus has to be enough right now in order for you to worship him with a full and complete heart. Because those of us who aren't satisfied, even when we get that thing, we're still going to be wanting Jesus to do more. Kind of like the person who thinks that they're dying of thirst. Oh, I'm so thirsty, I'm so thirsty. And so instead of going to a nice glass of spring water, they go to a glass of salt water and they guzzle it down. And then when they get the salt water in their mouth and they suck it down, they're left wondering, like, why am I still thirsty? Well, you just drink salt water. Drink the spring water. Don't let your needs rob Jesus of his rightful place in your heart. If anything, your needs should draw you closer to Jesus. If anything, your needs should cause you to crave, to desire Jesus more and more. Keep Jesus as the focal point and he'll take care of all your needs. Undoubtedly, some people who are here or maybe even online, some people, they're going to disregard this warning. They're going to disregard this word from Acts chapter 14. And they're going to do what we see the rest of the crowd doing. Look at verse 11 with me. They're going to allow their prior knowledge of God to dictate how they worship him. They're going to allow what they think they know about God to dictate how they worship him. Verse 11, it says this: when the crowd saw what Paul had done, once they saw that Paul had performed a miracle, they shouted and saying in Lycaonian language, the gods have come down to us in human form. Barnabas they called Zeus and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the town. That was a local holy man whose temple was just outside the town, where he brought bulls and wreaths to the gates because he intended with the crowds to offer sacrifices. Everyone within earshot of what was going on, they would have heard the gospel. Everyone within earshot of what Paul was saying, they would have heard the gospel. But instead of inquiring about Jesus, instead of stopping to at least to wonder, to ponder what's going on, instead of doing all of that, they decided to throw a party. They're like, hey guys, like Hermes and Zeus are here. They just pulled up. They're like, get some beer, get some chips, pump up the jams. We about to show out. We want to love on these guys. You're laughing, but that's what they did. Like, they are going bonkers. They refuse to let go of their man-made, fear-based superstition and believe Jesus' preeminent truth. They refuse to let go of what they knew, what they thought they knew, and receive Jesus' truth. The reason why I say they threw a party is because that's what they did. There was this widely held myth that spanned some generations back that long time ago in Lystra, these two gods came down in the form of humans. And they walked among the people in Lystra there, and they were wanting the people in Lystra to worship them and to honor them and pay them tribute. But they looked around, and no one gave them tribute. And so these guys got offended. They got angry. And the legend goes, and it says that they destroyed everyone in that town, all people except for a husband and wife, because they were hospitable towards the gods. And so because of their generosity, the gods spared their life, and they also gave them a bunch of presents. And these people that we're reading about here in the text, that story would have been passed down from generation to generation. That myth, that legend would have been passed down from generation to generation. And so when they see the miracle being performed and they see these things happening, they're like, we don't want to screw this up. We don't want to get killed. We don't want to miss our opportunity to honor our pagan gods, our gods. And so they celebrate Barnabas and Paul as gods. They allowed their prior knowledge of God to dictate how they interacted with him going forward. Their worship, it was preceded by their superstition. They looked at the current events of the day and they surmised that these have to be them. They have to be the gods. Don't let what you think you know about God distort your worship. All of us bring preconceived notions to Christianity. All of us bring our past traditions, our past issues, our past experiences, things that were handed down to us. We all bring that stuff to the faith, to the Christian faith. And if we're not careful, we will begin to interact with God based upon what we knew about him before he saved us. What we knew about him before we ever cracked open his word. What we know about God, it influences our worship. It impacts how we relate to him. If you were taught that God is all wrath and no grace, then you're going to worship God. You're going to walk with God out of fear and duty. If we think that God is unknowable, we'll constantly be doing things to get God's attention. We'll be sending up vain prayers and different types of trinkets and different types of ritualistic type things, all because we want to get God's attention. If we think that God doesn't involve himself in our everyday lives, then we decide for ourselves what's right and wrong. We decide for ourselves what's passable in our culture. And I think that's a good indication of where we are right now. If we think that God is all love and no discipline, then we're like little kids who got left home by their parents and then we are having fun. Because mommy and daddy ain't never coming back. He's never going to discipline us. If we think that God is like Santa Claus, we're always going to be coming to God with our hands out and saying, give me God, give me more. If you want to worship God with a pure and a sincere heart, then learn all that you can learn about him. Learn about the God of the Bible. Learn how he interacts with us. Learn what he expects of us. And let that change, let that motivate how we worship him. Here's a fourth thing you can do regarding how to make sure that your worship stays vertically pointed at God. Number 4, point people that have misplaced worship to God and give him all the credit. The people who have a perverted or a twisted worship, like, help them to see God, point them to God. And once they see God, like, give God all the credit for doing that work, which is exactly what we see the apostles doing in verse 14. Look at verse 14 with me. It says, the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, after receiving this response, they tore their robes when they heard this, and they rushed into the crowd shouting, people, why are you doing these things? I love this confession. They're like, we are people also, just like you. And we are proclaiming good news to you that you turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to go their way, although he did not leave himself without a witness, since he did what is good by giving you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons and filling you with food and your hearts with joy. Sadly, in verse 18, it says that even though they said these things, they barely stopped the crowds from sacrificing to them. These folks are bent on worshiping Paul and Barnabas the way that they want to. The apostles are repulsed by the crowd's response. They don't want any parts of God's glory, and they're quick to point these people right back to God. They're like, why should you worship us? We're human beings just like you. Why would you do this? We're just mere messengers. We're here to tell you about Jesus. We're not God himself. We're not gods. And we read this, And we think to ourselves that this would never happen. No one would ever come to you and worship you. No one is ever going to lift you up on a pedestal. No one is going to be impressed by you. No one is going to be moved by you. Well, it may not happen to that same level. You may not get Zeus and Hermes level. You may not get Michael Jackson level worship, but it will happen. It can happen. Because people who have misplaced worship, they look for people to latch onto. They look for people to inspire them. They look for people to model themselves after. They look for people to idolize, and they hold them in high regard. And if you're not careful, if we're not careful, if I'm not careful, if we're not on guard, you can get caught up in the praise. You can start to believe the hype. You can start to believe that you are somebody special when you're just an everyday average person. You can get there. You can start to think that you deserve to be celebrated for your accomplishments, that people are blessed just to be in your presence. Be careful, loved ones. Don't fall victim to this. And if you think that someone is currently doing this, or you think someone has a tendency to do this, then I would encourage you to do what you see being done in the text by Paul himself. Number one, Paul humbles himself. He breaks himself down to their eye level. He humbles himself in front of them. He diminishes his worth and his stature in their presence. They're like, no. He's like, no. I'm not special. I'm not a God. I'm a mortal just like you. Number two, after you humble yourself, point them right back to God. Point them right back to God. Explain to them why they think that you're special by pointing them back to God. Help them to see that your success, whatever it is, how great or how little, how average it is or whatever it is, help them to see that your success is a gift from God, that you have what you have and you do what you do and you roll the way you roll because God has been generous to you. You're not special. Help them to understand that the compassion that you showed them, help them to understand that the time you spent with them to help grow them, help mature them, or whatever your relationship is like with that person, help them to understand it's a direct result of the fact that Jesus Christ has given you grace, that Jesus Christ has poured into your life, that Jesus Christ has groomed you from where you were to where you are right now. Help them to see that. Share the reason why God blessed you. Help them to think soberly about life. Help them to think soberly about relationships with other people. And hopefully, after doing all of that, they'll relent. But if they refuse to relent, if they refuse to drop the worship, if they refuse to let go of that, then it's better to damage or end the relationship than allow them to continue worshiping you. Because in the end, you're competing with God's glory. Loved ones, at the end of the day, the question on the table is this: who are you currently worshiping? That's the big question, right? That's the $50 million question. Can you say with a clean tongue and a pure heart that you're all about God and His glory? Or do you have a on again, off again in relationship with the Lord? Where when things are going well for yourself, when things are going good and you don't have any sickness, your bills are paid, there's no drama in your household, your boss isn't acting crazy, when things are okay, there's no need for God. There's no need for prayer. There's no need for church. But when something kicks up, when something happens that you can't fix, you run right back to the church house. You run right back to God. You re-engage God through prayer. If that's you, stop it. Like, commit your whole heart to Him. Or maybe you've never even heard about Jesus Christ. Maybe you could be watching online, or you're here today and you know there's a God, but you don't know how to relate to Him. You don't know what He can do for you and what you should be doing for Him. Maybe this is the first time you heard any of this stuff. If that's true of you, then I invite you after service to come up here. I would love to talk to you about that. And if you're watching online, we would love to talk to you about that. Just leave your comments or leave your questions in the comment section on Facebook there. Here it is, guys. Because we were created for no other purpose than to glorify God, we will never fully enjoy the life that he purchased for us until we give him all of our worship.